Right, so one of the reasons I'm filming this video today is that, as I say, I'm looking for my Lagan books, and I was hoping that they were in this corner, and they don't seem to be. So there you go. Normally I say there's loads of stuff in front of this, and down here there's normally a huge, really useful box full of clothes or something, and yeah, and there's some of my action figures, but we won't go into that, so we'll show you those again if you really want to see them. So this is sort of odds, really, and there's some Italian fiction in here. There's some things I haven't read. There's a few classics. The Magus by John Fowles, a revised version. So that is a second edition because it's revised. It has different content, and it's a first this. So it's the first printing of the second edition. So the first printing of a second edition is the first this. Hope that makes sense. And this is a really important novel, made a huge impact on me. I used to have the true first, the first impression in the original edition before it was revised, and I sold it. I bought it really cheaply as well in Salisbury. This is decades ago, and I sold it on because this is the version which I sort of cleave to. And this book had a massive effect on Christopher Priest. There was a huge influence on him, his prose style, his way of thinking. And I think without this, it would have taken Chris longer to get where he got, and I'm sure he'd say that himself, and we're both very passionate about it. Camus' The Plague in a nice Hamish Hamilton edition. Naked Lunch in his first hardcover edition for decades in the UK in Penguin cloth bound. I always laugh when I see this in work right next to sort of the Brontes, you know. Nothing wrong with Brontes, but boy, this is a different order of book. Amazingly famous vampire novel. That's Carmilla by J. Sheridan Le Fanu, recent hardcover issue from Profile, who also did this King in Yellow in hardcover. There's a bit of crime I've not read there yet. Donald E. Westlake, aka Richard Stark, Call Me a Cab. I've got to read that. I normally read these as soon as I get them. Shame Hardcase went to B format. They should have stuck with A. Ted Lewis, Billy Rags. I normally snap these up as soon as they're reissued and read them straight away, but I've got them in reserve because I've read so much crime the last 10 years. I'm trying to sort of step away from it till I'm in the mood. Jonathan Meades, great writer, and then some books of Italian interest. I'm just going to show you a couple of them. This is Catastrophe and Other Stories by Dino Buzzati, who is, I'm going to do a video about him at some point. I did one once and I had to take it down because of copyright reasons, to do with the film version, and it really annoyed me because it took me ages to do, and it was a good video, so I'm going to try and redo that at some point. But this guy, he's just amazing. He wrote science fiction, fantasy, surrealism, graphic novels, children's books. Incredible. Deserves to be much better known. So I think I'll probably do a video next year because one of his books is being reissued for the first time in the UK in something like 40 or 50 years. I think it's 50 years. Here's another interesting Italian novel. I'd say it was at SF, Malacqua by Nicola Pugliese. And this is, I got this as like an advanced copy, and this is a really interesting one. It came in the late 70s. It was in print for about 10 or 12 days, something like that. It had amazing reviews in Italy. And it's about the city of Naples. Rain starts and it floods, and it's very, very bizarre and dark. So it is a kind of, would you say it's an SF novel? It's metaphorically, it certainly is. Let's say call it a fabulation. And it went out to print, and the author didn't want it reprinted while he was alive, and he died sort of, you know, a little while ago, so it got reissued, but he wanted to suppress it, and it's never been clear why. So that's back in print. It's an interesting one to watch. So that's one box of miscellaneous stuff that I can't fit in anywhere else at the moment. This is a mini RU box of some of my Italian crime fiction and Italian literary fiction, which I won't sort of go into any depth. Here we're looking at some of my hardback classics and crime novels of various kinds, and we won't go into those in any depth either because, as I say, I'm looking for this Lagan book and I can't find it. It's really annoying. So I'm on the floor now, on my haunches as it were, and there's some Dobson new writings in SF, and this is sort of mostly mainstream stuff, and I put this in this new bookcase, and there's a few sort of associational things here. Christopher Fowler, Bureau of Lost Souls, horror novel, first edition. I've got the limited signed edition as well, and Chris signed this for me. Just see if I can find the signature. I did an event with him a few years ago, and people come up to me in the street and they say, you know, that event was so amazing. He's a real cult figure. I mean, I'm not as fond of his writing as I was. I don't think he quite does it for me sometimes, but really great guy, and he's what a raconteur. I could have talked to him for days, and he did this. So Steve, we go back a long way. We certainly do, Christopher. And there, that's Darkest Day, which is his horror novel, which was withdrawn, and he rewrote it, and it became the first of his Brian to May crime series, and he's written withdrawn in there, so that's a pretty scarce one to have. Now here's somebody who I've meant to talk about at the time, and I'm going to it. This is The Infernal Device by Michael Colin, the first of his Professor Moriarty series, and this came out end of the 70s, early 80s. Michael Colin has written all sorts of things: science fiction, fantasy, spy thrillers, what have you. Jobbing author, good guy. And I bought this as a remainder in Blackwell's Remainder Bookshop in Cardiff, sort of, I say, early 80s. And I like the idea of, you know, dastardly intrigue and international villainy, and me and my friend Gary used to laugh about this, but it's actually really good. And in it, Moriarty is portrayed as somebody who is actually secretly working in favor of the Empire, and he's got this cover thing, that this cover story is that he's a master criminal, and Sherlock Holmes keeps bumbling and getting in his way and is a bit of an idiot. And I am going to reread some Sherlock Holmes soon, but I've always found him as a character really annoying, which is funny because, of course, I really love The Lost World by Conan Doyle. So on Scott Bradfield's sage advice, I'm going to read The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, the short stories. And because I've never read them, it's the novels I tackled, I think. And probably the short stories are better, so we'll see. And yeah, there's some crime, there's some of my favourites. Ted Lewis, Donald E. Westlake, Charles Willeford, the geniuses of American crime. I'm not really going to show you what's behind there because it's more mainstream and crime stuff, because I want to save those for other non-SF videos, and I'm sure a lot of you will like SF and not interested in this stuff. But if you want to be a good, you know, a reader who can appreciate all sorts of things within SF, you are best to read some mainstream as well. Fantasy 100 Best Books, great selection there, edited by Colin and Morecock, love that. That's signed by Morecock. And Horror 100 Best Books. And down here I do have some of these reference books, so maybe we'll pull some out and have a look. Tom Dish's On SF, and you know, these over many years I've bought these and read them, and they've really sort of enhanced my enjoyment of science fiction, my appreciation of these writers. Barry Milesburg's Breakfast in the Ruins, which is the expanded edition of his book The Engines of the Night, very, very important one, and great stuff looking back at, you know, the way that SF writers were treated and what's wrong with the genre the last 20-30 years, all that miserable stuff. Well done, Barry. Here's a key one. Brian Aldiss, Trillion Year Spree, the second edition, the revised edition, that's from the 80s, co-authored with David Wingrove, The History of Science Fiction. The first version of that, the first edition was, let's think, that was back in the 70s when it was called Billion Year Spree, and it's a great read. You know, you should read that. I mean, it's out of date obviously, but it covers up to the mid 80s, and it's a really important stuff. So for, you know, from 1925 and the predecessors before that up to about 85, you know, to get your SF history behind you, that really is the thing. That'll put a lot into context for you. Fantastic stuff. Here's another great one which has also been revised. This is the first edition. There's now a newer edition of this, which is Adam Roberts' History of Science Fiction, which is great. So if you've read the Aldiss, this goes further because obviously Aldiss is no longer with us. I'm up to date. Adam's great writer, great guy, and this is fantastic. And because Adam teaches 18th and 19th century literature at Royal Holloway, he's a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature, which not many SF writers are. He teaches poetry, things like that. He really understands the corpus of literature, and he has amazing ideas, and his novels are always really stimulating, and this is a really great history of SF, so well worth picking up. And I'd say that's been revised fairly recently. So as we've started on the SF reference books, we may as well finish, as I say. And I say we won't finish because there are lots of others which are not done here. My paperback ones, really important book this. This is the Entropy Exhibition by Colin Greenland, which was again his dissertation, Michael Morecock and the British New Wave in Science Fiction. And you can probably pick this up fairly easily. That's a Routledge hardcover first. And this really is sort of like the key sort of academic book on the New Wave. Tells you all about what happens in the 60s. And this is the American, it's not the American New Wave, this is British New Wave, which is less about breaking taboos, even though that's part of it, and more about sort of forging serious quality writing, modernism, bringing SF into it and smashing them all together, and really moving the genre forward in a way that, you know, even the Americans generally weren't doing. The British really, really did it. And this is a great book. Colin, great little writer as well. Okay, and this is Loose Cannon by Charles Platt. There's not a lot to look at there. Charles Platt, this is non-fiction, great sort of English New Wave writer, spent a lot of time in America, and I think he's just still spent a lot of time in the States. I think he basically lives there, and there's nothing to see there really, but I do like Charles's stuff. He did some great New Wave work on New Worlds in the 60s, great little novels like The City Dwellers, fantastic stuff. Morecock, Death is No Obstacle, which is a book-length interview undertaken by Colin Greenland and transcribed. That's a fantastic one if you want to look at Morecock's works. Got an introduction by Angela Carter. Say no more, this is the quality material. Okay, so what have we got next? Norman Spinrad, Science Fiction in the Real World. Norman, opinionated, sharp, accurate, great writer, one of the New Wave masters, American New Wave master, a man of attitude, and you know, he's just great. And he looks at all sorts of stuff in here, really, really good. And you know, you can pick these up. I bought all of these when they came out. Most of these books are from the 80s, 90s, maybe early part of the century, but you know, you read this stuff and you get a real perspective. Norman, fantastic guy, met him once, fantastic, great guy. And he was very friendly, of course, with Philip K. Dick, and that's Philip K. Dick's The Dark-Haired Girl, which is a non-fiction treatise on the dark-haired girl, one of his obsessions, published by Zeising, Mark Zeising, great American sort of Californian small press publisher, great stuff. Never met him, bought some of Zeising's books, fantastic stuff, really is really good. And that's an interesting and uncommon PKD. Brian Aldiss, Bury My Heart, W.H. Smith's, which is one of Aldiss did 2 autobiographies. There's one called The Twinkling of an Eye, which is on. This is more about his writing life, as it says. This is fairly common, great stuff. You know, Brian had a very long, great writing life. This dates from the 80s, and you learn a lot about his craft from this, which is fantastic stuff. It really is. I keep saying fantastic stuff. I know it's terribly irritating, but you know, maybe I need to get the list of superlatives together. When I used to be writing books, I would have a list of superlatives to describe things with, and a list of negatives as well, so maybe I need to go back to that. And looking down here, so that's the very back of this case, what we have here, Ballard, User's Guide to the Millennium, which is essays, extreme metaphors, interviews with J.G. Ballard, John Baxter's controversial biography of Ballard, which I actually quite enjoyed. A lot of people who knew him far, far better than me, I only had passing acquaintanceship with him, really were offended by it. But I think it's a good book, but maybe the definitive one is yet to emerge, and I've probably alienated most of the Ballard community now saying I enjoyed it. But I think the people I know, or I've been in touch with, or had contact with, or brushes with, who knew him better than me, probably, you know, do have primacy in that area. So I yield to them, and so we'll say, yeah, maybe his best is to come. Kim's book on PKD, which is marvellous, UMI Research Press, novels of Philip K. Dick. I bought that new in 1987, £28. It was in print then. Now, you know, very scarce and collectible. And here's some Underwood Miller volumes of PKD's letters. I think there were 5 or 6 of these. They came out of sequence. I think I've got 4 of them. I think I'm missing 1 or 2. I think there were 5, and they were very expensive at the time. They were signed editions, which were super limited. These were sort of limited trade editions, and that's the letters from 72, 73. And I think the first one to come out was this one. Yeah, I'm pretty sure it was, which is the 74 ones. And in this, Dick describes how he, you know, well, he doesn't describe it, you see it in his letters, and he goes through how he's realised that his agency, the Scott Meredith Literary Agency, who at times Barry M. Malsberg and Norman Spinrad worked for, and not to implicate them in what I'm going to say, how they had done a really bad job of dealing with the publishers' accounting, and the publishers were saying that Dick's books were out of print, they were getting reissued, and they were getting reprinted and sold on from rack spinners, you know, wire rack spinners, from drugstores and newsstands and, you know, sort of what have you, all around the UK for decades, and he didn't get those royalties, which is really, really bad. And of course, Dick, he was a sick man, and he had all these issues with drugs and strange experiences with pink lights and what have you, and he never got what he deserved, and he was married 5 times. You know, he had a tough life, despite the fact that artistically he really, really did it. And you know, you get the sort of letters, and you see why he got really angry about that. And this, of course, is 74. That's about the time when he, I think his book that year was, of course, Our Friends from Frolics 8. And you know, he hadn't written much for several years before that, so it was just before the late Renaissance when he started to move into a different phase, and this other editions. This is selections from the Exegesis in Pursuit of Varlis, and people go on and on and on about Varlis. I think you should read Radio Free Arbmouth instead, and then tackle Varlis, which I think is brave but flawed. It's very ambitious, and this is some of his literary, philosophical and religious writings, which are very in-depth, and there was going to be a second selection. It's edited by Lawrence Sutin, Dick's premier biographer, and I did ask, I think it was one of the guys, either Underwood or Miller, I asked them, you know, what was happening with the second volume, and I had a note which said, you know, give me a ring and I'll tell you, and I can't think which one of the two it was, but I think Underwood and Miller had a bit of a falling out, or there was some sort of schism, they parted company, and, you know, so the other one never happened. But it's tough stuff to read, it really is, but it's very serious, so there you go. Right, well, I haven't found my Legans, and down in this bottom corner there's some things I have found I wanted to show you. I've just realised, sort of just behind where the frame, what you can't see out of the frame, is my collection of Doom Patrol comics, which I've been wondering where they've gone, and I think they're all there, which is great, because I was looking at them the other day and couldn't find them. So there you go, that's good. I've got them all in sort of hardcover reprints, what have you, but it's nice to keep originals. So I hate books in odd formats. This is a Zeissing book. Again, this is Harlan Ellison's Mephisto in Onyx, which is a novella from late 90s, is it? And I need to reread this. It's okay. It's got sort of multiple conceptual breakthroughs towards the end, but they start to feel like nothing but gimmicks, and I wasn't fond of it. I think Ellison's best work was sort of like late 50s, 60s, early 70s, and I do think he went off the boil, and he didn't write much actual SF there. And you can pick this up fairly easily. There was a super limited one. This is a limited trade. And we've got some more reference books. We seem to be doing the reference book thing, but as I say, it's only part of it. Well, what can you see here? This is Science Fiction, the Best Novels, 1985 to 1910, by Damien Broderick and Paul DeFilippo. Paul, great guy, Deep End's contributor, who once said to me online, Stephen, keep writing. Well, you know, that's sort of encouragement one is heartened by, because Paul's a great little writer himself, fantastic guy. Done loads and loads of work, and very, very funny chap. My favourite book by him is a book called Roadside Bodhisattva, which was a PS limited edition mainstream novel, great stuff. And this came up, as you would think, round about 2011, and Damien Broderick is probably Australia's premier SF writer. And they pick their 100 best novels in SF between 85 and 2010, so that's kind of essential. Good stuff, that's still in print, you can get it. And this is its illustrious predecessor by the very wonderful David Pringle, Science Fiction, the 100 Best Novels, his own subjective but very, 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 very well informed take on the best SF from, I think it starts with 1984, so it's late 40s up to 85, it ends with Neuromancer. And it's been in and out of print since then. It's absolutely fantastic. It's a massive influence over me. Again, helped bring context. And I would say probably after the Encyclopedia of SF, probably the most important science fiction reference book I've read. And as I've said before, David is a Deep Ends contributor. The stuff he does in Deep Ends, the Ballard chronology, is fantastic. I'm hoping that becomes a book in itself, and it's great. And a few years after that one, this is more like 87-ish. David did this Modern Fantasy 100 Best Novels, followed by Brian Aldiss. This is really, really fantastic, and this is very broad. It's not just sword and sorcery, it's the fantastic generally. Grafton, look at that. I didn't buy the hardcover, I wish I had. Trade paperback, and I think this is out of print now, long out of print, but again, you know, David is so well read, you know, and it's not like, this isn't all your formulaic stuff. This is the really imaginative stuff, the stuff that really will blow your mind, and is beautifully written. So a wonderful, wonderful guide to modern fantasy. Obviously there's nothing in there after the mid-80s. My own book, 100 Must-Read Fantasy Novels, came out in 2009. I did try and put more of the popular sword and sorcery things in, because mine's a more an objective overview and includes the sort of commercial side of things. So between those two, you'll get a sort of really good feel for the sort of history of fantasy writing essay. But I can't hope to come up to David's great skill. And I didn't have the same brief I wasn't able to write a book as long as I wanted to, because, you know, publishers, they commission you to do non-fiction, and sometimes you've got to stay within the parameters they want. You know, you've got to sort of satisfy your brief. You sign the contract and you do the job. That's what being a professional is all about. Morecock's book on fantasy, wizardry and wild romance. This is from the late 80s. It sort of grew out of a smaller chapbook called Epic Pooh. That's Winnie the Pooh, of course, P-O-O-H. And it's his study of epic fantasy. So he looks things like Tolkien, Pratchett, what have you, his own work. And, you know, I was saying, most of these reference books are first as well. And this is signed. I got dozens and dozens of things signed by Mike from the sort of various times we did events together and what have you. What a great guy he is. Looking forward to the new Elric novel this Christmas. And this is a lovely one, worth picking up as well. So the Pringle, if you have the Pringle and the Morecock and have my little book, you know, as an adjunct, you've really got good sort of basic fantasy reference library there. And of course you should, as I say, have the Encyclopedia of Fantasy, because it's just mind-blowing. And I've had it since it came out and I'm still scratching the surface. It's so huge and there's so many amazing ideas in it. So if you want to sort of get into, you know, all the theories and stuff, it's just fantastic. And I find people say, oh, I don't need all that theoretical stuff. Well, I find this with reading is that the more that sort of thing you read, the more you discover when you go back to books, and it really does sort of bring them to life and widens your consciousness, and it's really sort of important. So I'm kind of ending here on this bit with this anthology, Extra Solar, which is from PS, and I got this in when they're online sales, about £5. I'm not ready yet. It's got lots of good sort of contemporary stuff, lovely laminated boards there, and you know, PS, they do lots of great work. You know, they keep smaller writers who don't have such big commercial careers going, and they're always groundbreaking, and there's sort of some big names in here. Let's have a look. You've got Al Reynolds, Gregory Benford, Aliette de Bodard, Paul de Filippo, Terry Dowling, Robert Reed, Ian Watson, Nancy Kress, Lavi Titar. Gosh, there's some great names in here. Catherine Angunen, Macaulay, MacLeod, McDevitt, all the Mucks. So yeah, so I must really sort of get stuck into that and catch up a bit with what's happening in traditional SF short stories. Fantastic stuff. Beautiful book. So if you go on the PS website, they have another website which is called PS2. And PS2 is where they sell their books which have got dinged, or which they're down to the last few copies and they're not moving, so they cut the price of them. You can get some really great bargains on there. And of course, they're all limited editions. They do signed limited editions and they do limited trade editions. Usually the signed ones are gone. But watch the PS2 website. Fantastic stuff. You can get some beautiful books on there at really good prices and help support Peter Crowther and the fantastic work he's done at PS for well over 20 years now. Okay, so what's at the back here? Some mainstream fiction, some spy thrillers, some Mick Herron. There was all signed first. Mick's a friend of mine, great guy. I was sort of pushing him before he became a bestseller, and we got to know each other, did some events together. Lovely, lovely chap. Joe Hill, Heart-Shaped Box, and my favourite horror novels of recent years. Jane Johnson, of course, is one of Jane's books. Hi, Jane. Jane is she's the main girl at the main woman, I should say, at HarperCollins Voyager. She looks after Tolkien's legacy. She has done since the mid-80s when I first met her, when she worked for Unwin, and she's curated Tolkien, and she's George R. R. Martin's editor in the UK. Fantastic lady, she really is, and a great writer herself as well. She's written some fantasy novels as Jude Fisher. There's a Dean R. Koontz there, Twilight Eyes, which is really, really uncommon. That's worth about £100. And I'm not a Dean R. Koontz fan, but I love the jacket of that book. Graham Masterton, Jed McCura's American Adulterer, amazing mainstream novel. Jeff Noon's first crime novel, a bit more crime there. I guess I'll show more of this stuff when I do more things about crime and general fiction, really, I suppose. More mainstream stuff. So my favourites: Paul Auster, Isabel Eberhardt, Newt Fallbacken, Alistair Gray, Trevor Hoyle, Gary Indiana, all great writers. Robert Nye, you can see I've got loads of Robert Nye. I love Robert Nye. And at some point I'm going to talk about, when I do an Arthurian thing, I'll talk about his novel Merlin, which I don't have here. I must have that with my fantasy novels. John Reschy, marvellous writer. So I guess I'll cover those things again. Some of those will come up, I think, in 100 Must Read Books for Men strand, which I must do a new video on soon. It's only going to be a quick look. I'm not going to get them out. I'm going to do these another stage. You see I've got tons there, and you saw some Daleks on the top. I'm not really much of a Doctor Who fan, but I did have a renaissance a couple of years ago during the lockdown where I watched a load of old 60s and 70s Who, the sort of things I saw when I was a kid. I used to be a big collector of Marvel Masterworks. I cut my collection down quite a lot. These are all first printings, first editions. They're limited, they're numbered, they have got this gilt on the cover. And I was buying a heck of a lot, and I've probably sold about a third of the ones I owned. And they got pretty expensive. And I basically decided to cut back to the stuff that I read as a kid. And then as I reread some of it, the latest stuff, once you get Jerry Conway involved instead of Roy Thomas, things sort of really sort of become repetitive, and it's just like sort of they're trying to sort of replicate what Lee and Kirby did, and it's not really the same. I'm more of a sort of Lee Ditko, Lee Kirby, Roy Thomas, and all the other sort of early artists and what have you. Roy Thomas is kind of my idol really, and I sort of worship Stan Lee as well. I know people go on about him being, you know, he didn't give the credit to the artist. I think that's absolutely untrue. I think he did. And I think without his guiding editorial hand and his vision, that you wouldn't really have had the Marvel Universe in the shape it's in. So obviously lots of other things, you know, the things you'd expect: Watchmen, Dark Knight Returns, some Grant Morrison. I do love Grant Morrison. Some stuff from about 14-15 years ago when I briefly got back into Marvel. Doom Patrol, finest superhero comics ever written. That arc there is just amazing, you know, it's fantastic. And that's the omnibus. Animal Man, Grant Morrison. I mean, Alan Moore precedes Morrison, and Alan Moore sort of set the standard, but for me, Morrison, Granty, when he's on it, he's the best. He really, really is, and he was really on it in Doom Patrol and its predecessor, Animal Man. Fantastic. Taking these flaky old DC things, which nobody knew what to do with, and they seemed a bit silly and strange, and he made them even stranger, and brought all sorts of stuff from philosophy and art and what have you in. Captain America, I'm a huge Captain America fan. I haven't read it for years, so I admit I read 40s stuff, 50s stuff, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, noughties, and then I sort of fell off after Steve Brubaker left, because he was the one really, and it was never the same after that. And lots of omnibuses. These are all things I read as a kid and I loved. You know, Werewolf by Night was a big one for me. X-Men was a big one, and I do like the Ultimates actually at the bottom there. So yeah, so we'll have a look at some of those in more depth at another time. And I think this is something I'm going to flash now, because it's sort of in space, but it's a Gollancz graphic novel. This is The Luck in the Head by M. John Harrison and Ian Miller, laminated boards, hardcover, first edition. And there's a lot of people very envious of this. I think The Occupier, Phil, hey Phil, does music on my channel, and that's signed by M. John. I got him to sign that for me last time we did an event together, which was about 2018, I think. And there you go, beautiful stuff. Very Peakian, very new weird, very M. John, who was weird before the new weird, before China Michael and those sort of people. So, you know, and, you know, China Michael, good guy, communist, you know, you can't go wrong really. And anyway, just to show you, this is what the average Marvel Masterwork will look like. So if you've never seen them in the gold foil limited first printing, first edition, so there you go. So there we are. So that's one corner of the shelf tour. And just to sort of recap, we'll zoom up a moment. Oh gosh, getting it from the floor. So thinking back to what Matt Defoe said in his shelf tour, as you see, I go with format as well. I go with format and publication order. That's the way I roll. That's my jam. That's how we do it. So that's a little insight into a, you know, somebody who's been collecting for, how long have I been collecting? It's coming up to, let me see, it's coming up to 40 years as a first editions collector. I've never had tons of money to collect. It's all been about love and cherry picking and getting the best. I'm doing some nostalgia collecting now, as I say. No doubt there'll be more. And now I've got to put everything back again because I still haven't found those Legans. Hope you enjoyed that. Please like, subscribe and comment. Do like, because it affects the algorithm. We really need more views on this channel so I can keep funding it. And thanks to everybody for watching. And bye for now. I'll see you again very soon.